"You're coming with me," said the rancher when her in-laws cut her hair and blackened her face. The first scream cracked through the still air like a rifle shot, sharp enough to make Eli Mercer stop mid-stride. He had been on his way to the blacksmith, thinking only of the busted hinge on his corral gate, when the second scream rose, ragged, choking, and swallowed too soon. Something in its sound pulled at a place in him that had been quiet for years, the place that recognized fear when it was too raw to hide. He turned toward the narrow run between the stable and the feed store, where shadow pooled in the midday heat. A crowd pressed in there, women in dust-gray skirts, a few men lingering just far enough back to claim they weren't part of it. The air was thick with the sour smell of sweat and dust, and the murmurs of those watching were laced with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Pushing through the onlookers, Eli caught sight of her. A young woman, thin as fence wire, cheeks smeared black as if she'd been dragged through soot, was held on a rough stool. One hand gripped the edge of the seat, the other was wrenched behind her by a man whose stance was casual but whose fingers bit deep into her arm. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's. They fixed on a spot in the dirt, as though looking up might make it worse. Beside her, a woman old enough to be her mother, broad across the shoulders, jaw sharp as a hatchet, brandished a pair of shears. The metal caught the light, flashing just before the blades closed on a thick lock of the girl's auburn hair. The strands fell to the ground, dull against the dirt. Another cut. Another tumble of hair. The older woman's voice was like a lash, each word meant to sting. Shameful. Lazy. Worthless. She spoke loud enough for the onlookers to hear, loud enough to etch her verdict into the air. Eli didn't stop to think. He stepped forward, boots grinding against the grit, and the mutters around him thinned into a wary hush. His shadow stretched over the scene, swallowing the edge of the stool. The shears paused mid-cut, and the older woman looked up, eyes narrowing. "She's coming with me," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, but it carried in the way a distant storm carries. Quiet now, but promising something if you ignored it. A few in the crowd laughed, short and unsure. The man holding the girl tightened his grip, straightening like he'd been challenged. "Ain't your concern," he muttered. Eli's gaze didn't waver from the girl. "Stand up," he told her, steady and plain, as if no one else were there. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who'd been struck too often to believe a voice could be gentle. The man shifted, his free hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Eli closed the space between them in 3 steps. His left hand came to rest on the man's shoulder. Not hard, not yet, but with the weight of a man who'd moved cattle heavier than him. The man's stance faltered. "I said," Eli repeated, "she's coming with me." The older woman scoffed, tossing the shears into a bucket with a clang. "You think you can just take her? She's ours by law. She married my boy. She belongs to us now." Eli let the silence hang until it was uncomfortable. Not anymore. He pulled his neckerchief loose, worn soft from years in the sun, and draped it around the girl's shoulders, covering the torn seam at her collarbone. It was a small thing, but it cut through the moment like a clean wind. She stood, slow, unsteady, her knees trembling as though they might fold. Someone muttered in the back of the crowd, and the sound of boots scuffing against dirt followed them as they moved aside. Eli didn't look away from her until they were walking, his hand hovering just near enough to steady her if she stumbled. They stepped into the sunlight, the heat slamming down like a physical thing. Whispers followed, names, curses, guesses, but they slid off Eli like rain off oilskin. They reached his horse, tied at the post near the corner of the store. The gelding turned his head as they approached, ears flicking. The girl stopped short. The saddle seemed too high, the leap too far. Eli didn't ask permission. His arms slid under her easily, lifting her like she weighed no more than a sack of grain. He set her in the saddle in front of him, her spine rigid until his arm came around to catch the reins. They moved out at a walk, the steady rhythm of hooves marking the distance between them and the crowd. Eli didn't look back, but he knew eyes followed them until the bend in the road took them out of sight. The town gave way to open land, sagebrush, dry creek beds, the horizon drawn sharp against the sky. She kept her gaze ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles pale. A lock of hair, cut uneven, stirred against her cheek in the breeze. After a mile, her breathing slowed, though she still sat stiff as a fence post. He could feel the tension in her back through the space between them. He said nothing. Words were a weight best added when a person was ready to bear them. The sun slid lower, shadows stretching long over the land. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. By the time they reached the edge of the dry creek, the sound of town had fallen away completely, replaced by the hush of wind through grass. The gelding stepped down the bank, hooves thudding softly in the sand before climbing the far side. At the crest, Eli slowed. The girl's head turned slightly, as if sensing something shift. Over the far ridge, faint as the line of a pencil against paper, 3 riders appeared. They were too far to make out faces, but their presence was a shadow across the gold of the evening. Eli's hand tightened on the reins. He felt her go still in front of him, the air between them suddenly taut. Neither spoke, but in that quiet, both knew this wasn't over. The gelding's hooves found the narrow trail that wound away from the creek, climbing into country where the grass lay flattened by wind and the sky seemed to rest heavy on the earth. The young woman sat in front of Eli, her shoulders taut, the borrowed neckerchief still clutched in one hand as though it were the only thing tethering her to the moment. She did not look back toward the ridge where those distant riders had been. Neither did he, though he felt the knowledge of them, as sure as a nail driven into green wood. The road was long, a ribbon of pale dust threading through sage and scattered mesquite. Near dusk, they crested a rise and the cabin came into view. Small, weathered boards bleached by years of sun, a slanting porch, smoke just beginning to curl from the stovepipe. Below, the pasture rolled out toward a windmill that creaked in the breeze. A pair of cattle raised their heads, chewing lazily, before going back to the grass. Eli slowed the horse to a walk. "We'll stop here." It was the first thing he'd said in miles. She nodded without meeting his gaze. When the gelding halted at the porch, he swung down and turned to lift her. She stiffened at his touch, then allowed him to ease her to the ground. Her boots landed on the step with a muted thud. "Sit," he said, tilting his head toward the bench by the door. "I'll bring water." She obeyed, lowering herself to the bench's far end, the flannel shirt he'd left in the saddle still draped over her lap. Her eyes roamed over the yard, chicken coop near the sidewall, a pile of split wood stacked with the neatness of habit. The air smelled faintly of juniper smoke and the faint tang of rain far off. Eli returned with a tin basin and a clean rag. He set them beside her, then crouched to pour cool well water in until it lapped the rim. "For your face." Her fingers trembled as she dipped the rag, squeezing it out before lifting it to her skin. Black streaks ran down her cheeks, swirling into the basin's water. She worked in silence, the sound of the cloth moving against her skin the only thing between them. When she was done, she glanced at him as if to ask whether she had missed any spot. He shook his head once. "I'll see to the stock," he said, rising. He left her there on the porch, the basin at her feet. From the barn came the low sounds of animals greeting their keeper, the soft thud of hooves, the rustle of hay. Inside, she found the cabin dim but tidy. A worn table with 2 chairs. A small stove with an iron kettle resting on top. The scent of coffee lingered faintly, though the pot was cold. She moved slowly, touching nothing. In the corner stood a narrow bed covered with a faded quilt, its colors softened to earth tones. Beside it, a peg on the wall held a folded blanket. She guessed that was his bed, the one by the cold hearth in the main room. When he came back in, the last of the day's light had gone, leaving only lamplight spilling across the floor. He carried 2 plates, beans with bits of bacon, and cornbread thick enough to fill a palm. He set one in front of her, the other at his place across the table. "Eat." She did, slowly, tasting each bite as though food was something she'd once known but had forgotten the shape of. He didn't speak, only watched the firelight shift over the walls. When she set her fork down halfway through, murmuring a quiet thank you, he took it as enough. After the dishes were cleared, he stoked the stove until it gave off steady warmth. He unrolled a bedroll near the hearth and gestured toward the small bedroom. "You take that one. Door stays open, just in case you need something." She lingered in the doorway, glancing back at him. His head was bent over the task of checking the rifle that leaned by the wall. Quiet, methodical work. She closed the door only part way, the narrow gap letting the lamplight spill into the dark. The wind rose in the night, rattling the shutters. She lay awake, listening to it scrape along the roof. Once she thought she heard a horse somewhere beyond the fence, but when she looked toward the crack in the door, Eli was still on the floor, his head resting on a folded coat, breathing even. At dawn, she rose and pulled on the flannel shirt. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. She stepped onto the porch and saw him at the pump, filling 2 buckets. His breath clouded in the pale light, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled to his elbows. He didn't look surprised to see her, only nodded toward the bench again. She sat while he carried the water past the chicken coop. A hen clucked sleepily, hopping down from its perch. The land here felt different from the one she'd left behind. Still hard, still wide and unforgiving, but quieter somehow. When he returned, he handed her a tin cup. "Coffee," he said. It was strong and bitter, but it warmed her. Through the day, she began to move more freely inside. She found a broom by the wall and swept the porch, careful not to raise too much dust. She washed the basin and cup after breakfast, setting them upside down on a clean towel. Eli said nothing about it, though she caught him glancing at the kitchen once, his expression unreadable. Late that afternoon, she watched him from the porch as he mended a section of fence. The sun was sliding toward the horizon, painting the grass with amber light. He worked steadily, shoulders shifting under the weight of the post he set into the ground. There was no wasted motion, no hurry. When he came back, he left his hat on the porch rail instead of carrying it inside. She realized she'd never seen him without it in town. Without the brimmed shadow, the lines around his eyes were more visible, lines carved by sun, wind, and long days alone. As evening fell, they ate again at the table, the sound of crickets drifting in through the open window. Afterward, he brought out a small jar of salve and set it on the table between them. "For the scratches," he said, glancing at her cheek. She hesitated, then opened it. The smell of pine resin rose up, sharp and clean. That night, she left the bedroom door wider than before. The wind had quieted, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. She lay awake for a while, listening to the faint creak of the rocker on the porch as Eli sat there, unseen, keeping watch over the dark yard. It was nearly sleep when the thought struck her. How far they were from town, from those who had cut her hair and blackened her face. But distance didn't always mean safety. And somewhere in that space between waking and dreams, she wondered if the riders on the ridge had followed the same road they had taken home. The days began to find their shape. Mornings broke with the sound of Eli's boots on the porch boards, the windmill turning slow in the cool air. Clara moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, keeping to the edges, her presence as light as the scent of wood smoke lingering from the stove. She spoke little, yet there was a shift, small, almost hidden, in the way her gaze lifted more often, how her shoulders no longer curled inward quite so much. It was on the 3rd evening, while the kettle hummed and dusk gathered at the windows, that her voice carried something more than necessity. She had been sitting at the table, mending a tear in the flannel shirt, when she said, without looking up, "You want to know why they did it?" It wasn't a question. Eli didn't answer right away. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, set one in front of her, and took the chair opposite. "My husband's been dead near 2 years, she began. The needle moved in her hand, steady despite the tremor in her tone. He was thrown from a mule while hauling timber. Broke his neck before they could get him home. She swallowed, and the pause was filled with the faint hiss of the stove. I stayed on with his people. There was nowhere else to go. His mother. She had a way of looking at me, like I'd taken something from her she meant to get back. She told him how the work grew heavier with each season, how she was made to rise before dawn and sleep after the lamps burned low, the best cuts of meat kept from her plate. They said I was bad luck. Crops failed. Hens stopped laying. It was my fault. Always mine. Her eyes flicked up to him, then down again. The first time they cut my hair, it was to humble me. This time, the thread tightened in her hands. This time they meant to break me for good. Eli sat still, his fingers loose around the mug, though the heat of the coffee barely touched him. And they nearly did, he said, not as judgment, but as a plain fact. Her gaze hardened a little at that, though her voice stayed low. They don't like to be shamed in front of the town. You taking me? They'll see it that way. He didn't argue. He'd lived long enough to know the truth of it. The next morning, a boy from the store in town rode up on a thin mare, dust streaking his face. He handed Eli a folded scrap of paper, the edges smudged with dirt. The message was blunt. Clara's in-laws were claiming she'd stolen clothes, silver, and a quilt, and that Eli had abducted her. The words dripped with righteousness, but the intent beneath them was clear. She was to be returned, or they'd come for her. Eli burned the paper in the stove before Clara could see it. But that night he checked the rifle by the door, made sure the hammer moved clean, and stacked more wood closer to the porch. Clara noticed. She always noticed the small things. How his gaze cut to the road more often, how he moved the lamp from the front window to a place less visible. She asked him once, "Are you expecting someone?" He didn't meet her eyes when he said, "Some folks don't like being told no." She said nothing more, but her hands worked harder the next day, hauling water without being asked, sweeping the porch twice over. It was as if she could brace herself with motion, keep the edges of fear from creeping in. That evening, the air carried the damp, metallic scent of rain far off. A wind came up from the west, cool against the skin. They ate in near silence, the kind that held more weight than weariness. Outside, the shadows lengthened over the pasture, the windmill groaning softly. When the light was nearly gone, Eli stepped out to latch the barn door. From the porch, Clara watched him pause halfway across the yard, head turning toward the road. He stood that way for a moment before finishing the latch and coming back inside. She didn't ask what he'd seen. But when she lay down later, she found herself staring at the narrow crack of the open door, listening for a sound beyond the steady thud of her heartbeat. The following morning, she was kneeling by the garden bed, turning soil with a short-handled spade, when the wind shifted. It carried a faint, rhythmic thump, too heavy for the windmill's blades. She froze, her hand still buried in the earth. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the rustle of grass and the far-off call of a crow. Eli's voice came from the porch. "You hear it too." She looked up at him, the sun glinting off the edge of his hat brim. He wasn't asking, and she didn't answer. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered over the ridge, piling dark against the sky. Eli brought in the wash from the line before the wind could tear it loose. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a shared thing, a rope strung tight between two posts. After supper, he sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees. Clara came to the doorway, the lamplight from behind catching in the uneven edges of her hair. "If they come," she said quietly, "it won't be for talk." His jaw worked once before he replied. "Then they'll get what they came for." A gust of wind rattled the porch boards, carrying with it the dry scent of dust rising ahead of a storm. The first pinpricks of rain dotted the steps. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, a horse snorted, the sound low and muffled by distance. Clara's fingers curled around the doorframe. The weight of her in-law's shadow stretched long over the land, and for the first time since she'd left town, she felt the tightness in her chest return. Eli didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "Best get some rest." She stayed there a moment longer, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, where the shape of the land might just have hidden the slow approach of more than rain. The storm came in with the morning, thick clouds rolling over the ridge like dark cattle driven hard. Wind rattled the shutters, lifting dust from the yard in sharp spirals. Eli moved with quiet purpose, tying the barn door against the gusts, setting the kettle to boil. His eyes went often to the road, the line of it vanishing into the low hills. Clara saw it too, though she kept her gaze lowered, her hands busy shelling beans at the table. By noon, the smell of rain was thick as smoke. Eli stepped out onto the porch, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. That was when he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, moving slow and deliberate, their shapes growing sharper against the bruised sky. Behind them came a wagon, its canvas flaps pulled back to reveal the stiff figure of the woman who had cut Clara's hair. Even from this distance, Eli could feel her eyes reach for the house like cold iron. Clara appeared at his shoulder, drawn by the sound of hooves over wet earth. Her breath caught. She knew each man. Her husband's brothers, one broad in the chest, the other narrow and quick-moving, their eyes carrying the same hard glint as their mother's. The fourth rider was a neighbor from town, a man who'd always found reason to speak too close to her in the mercantile, his smile never touching his eyes. They halted just beyond the fence line, the horses stamping, snorting in the wind. The mother-in-law rose in the wagon bed, her skirts snapping in the gusts. "You've got something of mine," she called, voice sharp enough to cut through the storm. "She's not yours," Eli answered. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried, steady and unshaken. "Not property. Not cattle to be traded." The broad brother laughed, short and ugly. "You think you can hide her out here? Law's on our side." Eli's jaw flexed. "You want law? Go to the sheriff." "We aim to settle it here," the narrow one said, shifting in his saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. The wind drove a sheet of rain sideways across the yard. Clara stood in the doorway now, her fingers gripping the frame, the uneven ends of her hair lifting in the storm's breath. Her heart hammered, but she did not step back. She had run once, and it had brought her here. The mother-in-law's eyes cut to her like a blade. "You come down now, Clara. You know where you belong." "No," Clara said. It was the first word she'd spoken since they'd arrived, and it surprised even her. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The wind carried it, clear as the crack of a whip. The broad brother swung a leg over, dropping from his horse into the mud. Eli stepped forward, the rifle now in his hands, angled toward the ground but ready. "That's far enough," he said. "You gonna shoot me in front of my own ma?" The man sneered. "If you cross that fence," Eli replied, "I'll do what's needed." The man hesitated, eyes flicking to the other riders. The neighbor muttered something low, leaning toward the narrow brother, but the words were lost in the wind. Then, from the far side of the road, another rider appeared, a lean, older man on a bay mare, coat flapping open to show the badge pinned at his chest. The sheriff. Behind him came two more mounted men, both with rifles across their saddles. The sheriff reined in, looking from Eli to the group at the fence. "Got word there was trouble brewing. Thought I'd see for myself." His voice was calm, but his eyes took in the set of Eli's stance, the mud on the broad brother's boots, the hard angle of Clara's grip on the doorway. "Family matter," the mother-in-law said, her tone sharpening into something almost sweet. "We're just here to take back what's ours." The sheriff shook his head. "Ain't how it works. Widow's her own person. Can't claim her like a stray calf." "She's stolen from us," the narrow one snapped. "Got proof?" the sheriff asked. Silence. The rain beat down harder, drumming on the wagon canvas. "Then I suggest you ride home," the sheriff said. "You cross onto his land, it's trespass, and I'll see you in irons." For a long moment, no one moved. The storm pressed around them, wind tugging at coats and manis. The broad brother looked at his mother, but she only spat into the mud, the fury in her eyes undimmed. "This isn't over," she said to Clara, her voice low but carrying. "Maybe not," Eli answered for her, "but it's over for today." The sheriff stayed until they'd turned their horses and the wagon creaked back toward the ridge. Only when they were gone from sight did he tip his hat and ride off the other way, his deputies following. Eli stood at the fence a moment longer, the rain soaking his shirt, plastering it to the breadth of his shoulders. Then he turned to find Clara still in the doorway, her knuckles white on the frame. "You're safe now," he said. She wanted to believe him. But in the distance, where the land dipped away into shadow, the echo of hooves still lived in her ears. The rain held for 2 more days, soft and steady, wrapping the cabin in a gray hush. The world beyond the yard felt distant, washed away in mist, and Clara found herself breathing easier for the first time since the wagon had pulled away. She rose early, as she always had, but the hours no longer felt like something to be endured. They had shape now, purpose. She fed the hens, swept the porch clear of damp leaves, mended the seams in Eli's work shirts without being asked. He moved about the place in his quiet, steady way, never pressing, never crowding, but always there, like the low hum of the windmill, a presence that could be relied upon without question. When the sun finally broke through, it lit the hills with a kind of light that made the wet grass shine silver. Eli was out in the pasture, leaning on the fence, when she brought him a cup of coffee. He took it with a nod, the steam curling between them, his eyes tracking the cattle as they moved across the slope. "Won't be long before it's planting time," he said. She followed his gaze, feeling the ground steady under her feet. In the evenings, they began to share the porch. At first she sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the light drain from the sky. He might speak of a fence that needed mending or a calf that had taken ill, and she would listen, offering a word here and there. Over time, her voice grew surer, weaving small threads of her own into the quiet fabric between them. What she remembered of the wild roses that used to grow behind her mother's house, the songs her father used to hum when mending harness. One night, as they watched the fireflies rise over the pasture, Eli stood and went inside. When he returned, he held a small wooden box. He sat back down beside her, setting it on the railing between them. "For when it's long again," he said, opening the lid to reveal a silver hair comb, engraved with a pattern of vines and small blossoms. The metal caught the last traces of light, winking softly. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface, and for a moment she could not speak. The gift was not for adornment. It was a promise, quiet but unshakable, that her dignity would grow back along with her hair. Spring settled over the land in full, the cottonwoods bursting into green, the creek running high with snowmelt. Clara's hair, though still short, had softened at the edges, framing her face in loose waves. She moved easily now between the cabin and the yard, her steps light but purposeful. The tension that had once bound her shoulders had eased, though Eli still caught her scanning the horizon some days when the wind shifted. It was in late April when a rider came up the road, dust in his wake. It was the sheriff, his badge catching the sunlight. He dismounted slow, tipped his hat, and said, "Heard your in-laws have decided to let things be. Sold the wagon." Two of the boys moved on. Clara listened without expression, but the breath she let out afterward was long and deep, as if she'd been holding it for weeks. That evening, she cooked a meal from the last of the winter stores: salt pork fried crisp, potatoes boiled and buttered, biscuits baked until golden. They ate in companionable silence, but she found herself glancing up at him more than once, a small smile tugging at her mouth. As the weeks turned, the work of the ranch pulled them into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. She planted a row of beans in the garden, tucked seeds for squash and corn into the rich soil. Eli repaired the roof before the summer storms could come, his broad frame outlined against the sky as he worked. Some evenings they'd sit by the creek, the water carrying the day's heat away in its constant murmur. It was on one of those evenings, the light gone soft and the air full of the scent of cottonwood buds, that Eli spoke without turning his head. "Don't reckon you plan on leaving now." It was not a question. She let the words rest between them for a moment. "I don't reckon I do," she said at last. He glanced at her then, and the faintest smile touched his mouth. Summer arrived in a rush, the days stretching long under a high, relentless sun. Clara learned to ride the gelding, her skirts gathered to keep from tangling, her hair lifting in the warm breeze. Eli taught her to guide him with her knees, to read the lay of the land, to feel when the horse was ready to move and when it needed to rest. There was laughter sometimes, low, startled, and shared, when the gelding shied at a jackrabbit or splashed into the creek without warning. By August, the garden was full, the beans climbing high, the squash heavy on their vines. Clara's arms had grown strong from the work, her skin touched golden by the sun. Eli watched her one afternoon as she bent to pull weeds, the silver comb catching the light where she had finally worn it, holding back a wave of hair that had grown long enough to tuck. Something settled in him then, something that had been restless for years. It was on a day in early autumn, when the air had turned crisp and the cottonwoods were beginning to drop their yellow leaves, that he asked her to walk with him down to the creek. The sun was low, laying gold across the water. He stopped near the bend where the bank dipped into a shallow pool, the same place he had brought the gelding to drink when he'd first brought her home. "I figure you've had enough taken from you," he said, his voice low. "I'd like to give you something that can't be taken." She looked at him, the wind stirring her hair. "And what's that?" "My name." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she smiled, small, sure, and without hesitation. "Yes." They married 2 days later under the cottonwoods, a traveling preacher stopping on his way to the next town. There was no crowd, only the sound of the creek and the rustle of leaves overhead. She wore the flannel shirt beneath her best dress, the silver comb in her hair. Eli stood beside her, his hat in his hands, looking at her as though she were the first sunrise he'd ever seen. Afterward, they returned to the cabin, the porch bathed in the soft light of evening. She leaned against him, the scent of pine smoke drifting from the stove, the sound of crickets rising from the grass. The land stretched before them, wide and open, carrying the quiet promise of seasons yet to come. In the days that followed, the work went on, fences to mend, animals to tend, meals to cook. But there was a change in the air, subtle as the shift from summer to fall. She laughed more, he spoke more, and when they passed each other in the narrow space of the cabin, their hands brushed without pulling away. One evening, as the sun bled out over the hills, Clara stood on the porch, watching the sky catch fire. Eli came up behind her, his arm slipping easily around her waist. "You know," he said, "I thought I was bringing you here to keep you safe. Didn't figure you'd be the one to set things right for me." She turned to him, the light catching in her eyes. "Guess we both got something we didn't expect." The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the faint promise of winter. Beyond the pasture, the horizon glowed with the last embers of day. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his hand against her side. And for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost, or what she might still have to defend. She was thinking about the sound of the creek in spring, the feel of the garden soil warming under her fingers, the weight of the silver comb in her hair, and the man beside her, who had stood between her and the storm and asked for nothing but her trust. In the fading light, the world felt still. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. They were only part of the story, a story still being written on this wide, wild land, with him. Now, click on the story on your screen that's even deeper than this one. You'll feel it long after the fire dies down. Go on. I'll be waiting. Sometimes a tale like this sits with you longer than you expect. A young woman, shorn and shamed, stood in the dust with nothing left but her will to endure. A man, quiet as the land itself, stepped between her and the cruelty that meant to break her. Together, they didn't just survive, they built something worth keeping. And now I want to hear from you. What stayed with you most, the moment he lifted her into the saddle without a word? The silver comb, waiting for hair to grow again? Or the vows spoken under the cottonwoods, with no one watching but the creek and the wind? If you've ever known what it is to stand by someone through storms, or to be given back a piece of yourself you thought was gone, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you hearing this story from tonight? Your words matter here, because each story is more than mine, it's ours. Now, there's another tale waiting for you. Click on the story showing on your screen. It runs even deeper, and I think it'll move you in ways you don't see coming. I'll be here, by the fire, ready to tell the next one.